A black teen's act of kindness, bringing food to a homeless man, takes a shocking turn when a racist stranger cruelly throws it away. What happens next will spark a chain of events that challenges hate and proves the enduring power of compassion. The air was crisp as Jamal Parker, a 15-year-old boy with a warm smile and a heart bigger than his small Ohio town, stepped out of the corner deli. His hands clutched a brown paper bag containing a sandwich, an apple, and a bottled water. It wasn't much, but to Jamal, it was everything, because it wasn't for him. Every Tuesday afternoon, Jamal took the $5 he earned from mowing lawns and used it to buy lunch for a homeless man named Robert, who sat by the bus stop on Main Street. Robert wasn't just some faceless stranger to Jamal. He was someone with a story, a past, and the kindness to always thank Jamal with a smile, despite his own hardships. That day, as Jamal walked down the cracked pavement toward the bus stop, he thought about their last conversation. Robert had told him about his days as a factory worker, before an injury had cost him his job, his home, and, eventually, the respect of many who passed him by. But not Jamal. To Jamal, Robert wasn't invisible. "Hey, Mr. Robert," Jamal greeted cheerfully, waving as he approached. Robert, bundled in a tattered grey coat, turned his weathered face toward Jamal, his eyes lighting up with gratitude. "Well, if it isn't my Tuesday angel," he said, his voice hoarse but full of warmth. Jamal handed him the brown bag, smiling. "Got you turkey today. They were out of ham." Robert chuckled, his gloved hands trembling as he took the bag. "Turkey's a feast to me, son." "Thank you." They sat together on the cold bench, chatting as cars rushed by, their headlights glowing faintly in the fading daylight. Jamal loved these moments. He didn't have much, but his mother had always taught him that kindness didn't require riches, just heart, and Jamal had plenty of that. But their peace didn't last long. From across the street, a man's voice bellowed, loud and sharp. "Hey, what are you doing?" Jamal's head snapped up. A tall, broad man in his late 40s stormed toward them. His face was red with anger, and his plaid jacket flapped against the wind as he strode closer. "Are you seriously giving him that?" the man demanded, pointing to the brown bag in Robert's hands. Jamal stood up instinctively, his heart thudding in his chest. "Yeah, why?" the man sneered, glaring at Robert like he was something less than human. "Because people like him don't deserve handouts. They'll just waste it or beg for more." He snatched the bag from Robert's hands. "Hey!" Jamal shouted, stepping forward, his small frame trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "That's his lunch. You can't do that." But the man didn't care. With a look of disgust, he hurled the bag into a nearby trash can. Jamal froze, his fists clenched and his eyes stinging with tears. Robert sat in silence, his head hung low, his dignity shredded in front of the boy who had always treated him with kindness. "You're just encouraging him to stay on the street," the man spat, his tone dripping with venom. "People like you don't get it." Jamal's voice cracked as he shouted, "People like me? You don't know anything about him, or me." The man scoffed, turning to walk away. "You're wasting your time, kid," he called over his shoulder, his voice fading into the noise of the street. Jamal stood there, his breathing heavy, his chest tight with frustration and hurt. He glanced at Robert, who was staring at the ground, his hands clenched together. Jamal felt a lump in his throat. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Robert," Jamal whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Robert lifted a hand to stop him, forcing a faint smile. "It's okay, son. It's not your fault. Some people just don't see others for who they are." Jamal nodded, swallowing hard as tears threatened to spill. He sat back down beside Robert, feeling helpless. For the first time, Jamal wondered if kindness alone was enough to fight the kind of hate they had just faced. That night, Jamal couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the scene over and over, the man's hateful words, the cruel way he tossed the lunch into the trash, and the look on Robert's face when it happened. It wasn't just the act that hurt. It was the message behind it, one that screamed, "You don't matter." Jamal sat up in his bed, the glow of the streetlights outside casting faint shadows on his walls. He clenched his hands into fists. He wanted to scream, to cry, to do something, but instead, he felt stuck. That helplessness weighed on him like a heavy blanket. His mum, Janice, must have heard him shifting because a gentle knock came at his bedroom door. "Baby, you okay?" she asked, poking her head in. Her soft brown eyes scanned his face, instantly catching the turmoil behind his forced calm. "I'm fine," Jamal mumbled, pulling his knees to his chest. Janice stepped in anyway, sitting down at the edge of his bed. "Fine doesn't look like that," she said gently. "What's wrong?" At first he stayed quiet, unsure how to explain. But as she sat there, her hand resting on his shoulder, Jamal felt the dam break. "There was this guy today," Jamal began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was giving Mr. Robert lunch like I always do, and this man, he came out of nowhere and just threw it away. He said people like Robert don't deserve help." Jamal's voice cracked, and he looked up at his mom, tears welling in his eyes. How can someone be so mean? Robert didn't do anything to him. Janice's face softened with a mix of sadness and anger. She pulled Jamal close, wrapping him in her arms. "I'm sorry you had to see that, baby," she said, her voice steady but tinged with pain. Some people carry hate in their hearts because they don't understand. It's not right, and it's not fair, but it happens." Jamal pulled back, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "But why? Why would he do that to someone who's already struggling?" Janice sighed, brushing a hand over his curls. "It's easier for some folks to look down on others than it is to see their own flaws. That man wasn't mad at Robert, not really. He was mad at whatever's missing in himself, and he took it out on someone he thought couldn't fight back." Jamal let her words sink in, but they didn't make him feel any better. If anything, they made the weight in his chest heavier. "It's not fair," he muttered. "Mr. Robert doesn't deserve that." "No, he doesn't," Janice agreed. "But the world doesn't get better by ignoring people like that man. It gets better when people like you keep doing what's right, no matter how hard it is." Her words hung in the air long after she kissed his forehead and left the room. Jamal lay back down, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts swirling. He couldn't shake the image of Robert's defeated face and the way the man had walked away like he'd won. The next morning, Jamal felt a spark of determination. He didn't have much, but he had his voice, his courage, and his unwavering belief that kindness mattered. If the man thought he'd scared Jamal off, he was wrong. That afternoon, Jamal returned to the deli with the same $5 in his pocket. The cashier, a kind older woman named Mrs. Price, smiled warmly as he approached. "Turkey sandwich again today, Jamal?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "And can you double the meat this time? I'll mow an extra lawn if I have to." Mrs. Price chuckled but didn't question him. As she wrapped the sandwich and added an extra apple to the bag, Jamal pulled out his wallet. She waved him off. "This one's on me," she said with a wink. "You keep doing what you're doing." Jamal's heart swelled with gratitude. He thanked her and left the deli, gripping the bag tightly as he walked toward the bus stop. When he arrived, Robert was there, just like always. But this time, he looked even more worn down, his shoulders slumped, and his usual faint smile nowhere to be seen. "Hey, Mr. Robert," Jamal said softly, sitting down beside him. Robert looked over, his expression tired but kind. "Hey there, kid," he replied, his voice heavy. Jamal handed him the bag. "I brought lunch again. I wasn't going to let what happened yesterday stop me." Robert hesitated for a moment, then took the bag with trembling hands. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "Yes, I did," Jamal replied firmly. "Because you matter, Mr. Robert. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." Robert's eyes glistened as he looked at Jamal, the boy's words striking a chord deep within him. "You're a good kid, Jamal," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't ever change." Jamal smiled, but deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. Something had to change, not just for Robert, but for everyone who had ever been treated like they were invisible. Word of the confrontation spread quickly in Jamal's small town. Mrs. Price, the deli cashier, mentioned it to a few regular customers. They told others, and soon the story of the boy who stood up for a homeless man became a topic of conversation at barbershops, grocery stores, and Sunday services. Jamal didn't know this, but the small kindness he thought would go unnoticed was starting to ripple outward. At school, a few of his classmates approached him during lunch. "Hey, Jamal," said Marcus, a tall, shy kid from his math class. "I heard what you did for that homeless guy. That was cool, man." Jamal shrugged, embarrassed by the attention. "I just brought him lunch. It's not a big deal." "No, it is," Marcus insisted. "Not many people would have done that, especially after what happened." A girl sitting nearby chimed in. "Yeah, my mom said that guy who threw the food away has been rude to everyone for years. Someone needed to show him he's not better than anyone else." Jamal shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't done it for attention, and he didn't want to make it about the man who'd tried to humiliate Robert. Still, their words sparked an idea. That afternoon, instead of heading straight home, Jamal went back to the deli. Mrs. Price smiled when she saw him walk in. "Back again so soon, Jamal? Another turkey sandwich?" Jamal hesitated before answering. "Not today, ma'am. I was wondering, do you think anyone else around here would want to help Robert? Maybe we could get him a few more meals, or—" Before he could finish, Mrs. Price reached under the counter and pulled out a donation jar. It was old, with a faded label that read, "Kindness Fund." She dusted it off and plunked it on the counter with a smile. "I started this a few years back for folks in need," she explained. "Hadn't thought about it in a while, but maybe it's time we put it to good use again." Jamal's face lit up. "Really? You think people will donate?" Mrs. Price chuckled. "In this town? You'd be surprised. Folks around here have good hearts. They just need a reminder sometimes." By the end of the week, the jar was nearly full. Customers had dropped in loose change, crumpled bills, and even a couple of checks. One man, a retired veteran, handed over a $50 bill and said, "Tell that boy he's got more guts than most adults I know." Jamal couldn't believe it. Every day after school, he stopped by the deli to count the donations. With Mrs. Price's help, they organized the funds into a plan. Meals for Robert, new clothes, and even a prepaid gift card for him to use however he needed. On Saturday, Jamal walked to the bus stop with his arms full. In one hand, he carried a new insulated lunch bag packed with sandwiches, snacks, and water bottles. In the other, a shopping bag full of clean clothes and toiletries. When he arrived, Robert was sitting on the bench, staring at the ground. Jamal called out, "Hey, Mr. Robert." Robert looked up, his face lighting up at the sight of Jamal. But when he saw the bags, his expression shifted to confusion. "What's all this?" Jamal set the bags down in front of him. "It's for you," he said simply. Robert's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared at the bags, then at Jamal. "But how?" Jamal grinned. The whole town helped. Mrs. Price put out a donation jar, and people chipped in. They wanted you to know that you're not alone and that you matter. Robert's hands trembled as he reached for the bags. He pulled out a thick, warm sweater, holding it up like it was made of gold. "I don't know what to say," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You don't have to say anything," Jamal replied. "Just promise me you'll take care of yourself, okay?" Robert nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "You have no idea what this means to me, Jamal. No idea." As they sat together, Robert shared stories about his life, his dreams as a young man, his regrets, and his hopes for a better future. For the first time in a long time, He felt seen, not as a statistic or a burden, but as a human being with worth and dignity. Across the street, a small crowd had started to gather. Neighbors who had heard about Jamal's efforts stood watching, some with smiles, others wiping away tears. Among them was Mrs. Price, her hands tucked into her apron as she watched the boy she'd come to admire. One man in the crowd, a tall figure wearing a familiar plaid jacket, stared from a distance. It was the same man who had thrown Robert's lunch away. His face was unreadable, his body tense as he watched the scene unfold. For the first time, the man didn't speak. He simply turned and walked away. Monday morning came with an unusual sense of anticipation. The story of Jamal's act of kindness, and the community's response, had spread beyond their small town. A local reporter had run a story titled, "Teen Teaches Town a Lesson in Kindness," featuring a photo of Jamal and Robert sitting together on the bus stop bench. The article had sparked conversations across the area, with many praising Jamal's compassion. But not everyone saw it that way. As Jamal walked through the halls of his high school, he could feel the weight of stares. Some kids smiled and nodded at him, while others whispered behind his back. He didn't mind the attention, but one voice cut through the noise like a sharp blade. "Hey, look! It's the charity case's best friend." Jamal turned to see Kyle Thornton, a senior known for his big mouth and bigger ego, leaning against a locker with a smirk. A few of his friends stood nearby, chuckling. "Bet you're feeling pretty good about yourself, huh?" Kyle sneered. "Helping out some bum like he's your little project." Jamal's fists clenched at his sides, but he took a deep breath, remembering his mom's words. "It's not a project," he said calmly. "It's just the right thing to do." Kyle laughed, shaking his head. "Right thing? You're wasting your time. Guys like that are a lost cause. You're not saving anybody." Jamal stepped closer, his voice steady but firm. "You don't know him. You don't know what he's been through. And even if you don't care about him, I do. That's enough for me." Kyle's smirk faltered just for a second, before he scoffed and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Jamal felt the tension drain from his body as he turned back toward his class. A few kids who had been standing nearby gave him encouraging smiles. He realized then that standing up for Robert wasn't just about helping one person. It was about showing others that compassion was worth fighting for. That afternoon, Jamal headed to the deli like usual, but as he approached, he saw someone unexpected waiting outside, the man in the plaid jacket. Jamal's heart raced. He hadn't seen the man since the day he threw away Robert's lunch. Now, here he was, standing awkwardly near the entrance, his hands stuffed into his pockets. Jamal hesitated, but then he squared his shoulders and walked up to him. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice guarded. The man looked down, shuffling his feet. I wanted to talk to you," he said gruffly. Jamal crossed his arms, his guard still up. "About what?" The man sighed, looking away for a moment before meeting Jamal's gaze. "About what happened at the bus stop. I shouldn't have done that. It wasn't right." Jamal blinked, taken aback by the sudden admission. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Why would you treat someone like that?" The man rubbed the back of his neck, struggling to find the words. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I was angry. Maybe I was tired of seeing people like him, sitting there day after day while I bust my back working. It's stupid, I know, but it's easier to blame someone else than to admit you're struggling too." Jamal studied him, his emotions a mix of anger and something else. Pity, maybe, or understanding. "You hurt him," Jamal said quietly. "You made him feel like he didn't matter." The man nodded, shame flickering across his face. "I know. That's why I'm here. I saw what you and the town did for him. It made me realize I was wrong." Jamal felt a lump rise in his throat. He didn't know what to say. After a long pause, he asked, "Did you come here to apologize to Robert?" The man hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, if he'll even listen to me. Jamal stared at him, searching for any hint of insincerity. But the man's eyes looked genuine, his shoulders slumped with regret. Jamal nodded slowly. He'll listen, he said, but you have to mean it. The man gave a faint smile. I do. Later that day, Jamal walked with the man to the bus stop, where Robert was sitting. Jamal could feel the tension as they approached, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Hey, Mr. Robert, Jamal called out, his voice steady but quiet. Robert looked up, his eyes flickering to the man beside Jamal. His expression hardened slightly, but he didn't say anything. Jamal gestured to the man. He has something he wants to say. The man stepped forward, his hands still stuffed in his pockets. Robert, he began, his voice low and unsure. I'm sorry for what I did. I was wrong, and you didn't deserve that. Robert's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the man. Why now? He asked, his voice calm but firm. The man hesitated before answering. Because I saw what this boy, what Jamal, did for you. He showed me what I couldn't see before. That you matter, that everyone matters. And I want to do better. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it. Robert was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady. Then, to Jamal's surprise, he nodded. It takes a lot to admit you were wrong, he said. I'll accept your apology, but only if you promise to treat people better from now on. The man's face softened with relief. I promise, he said sincerely. Jamal watched the exchange, his chest swelling with a strange mixture of pride and hope. Maybe kindness really could change people, even those who seemed beyond reach. As the man in the plaid jacket walked away that day, Jamal and Robert sat quietly on the bus stop bench, watching the world pass by. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The air was heavy, not with tension, but with something unspoken, healing. Finally, Robert broke the silence. You know, Jamal, when you first started bringing me lunch, I thought it was just about the food. But I was wrong. He turned to the boy, his eyes shining with gratitude. What you've done, it's not just filled my stomach, it's given me hope. Hope that there are still people out there who care. Jamal looked down, his cheeks warming. I just didn't want you to feel alone, he said quietly. No one deserves that. Robert placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder, his grip firm yet gentle. You've done more than you'll ever know, son. You've reminded me, and maybe even this whole town, what kindness can do. Over the next few weeks, things began to change in ways Jamal hadn't expected. The small community that had once passed Robert by without a second glance now began to see him as more than just a figure on a bench. Neighbors brought him coffee, blankets, and warm meals. Someone donated a sturdy new coat, and another person offered to help him find temporary housing at a local shelter. But it wasn't just about Robert. The story of Jamal's kindness had ignited something bigger, a conversation about how the community treated those in need. Churches and local organizations started hosting drives to help others like Robert. Mrs. Price's kindness fund grew so much that she had to replace the jar with a larger box. Jamal even received a call from a local TV station asking to interview him about his efforts. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't comfortable being in the spotlight. He just wanted to do what felt right. But his mom encouraged him. Sometimes sharing your story isn't about you, Janice said. It's about showing others what's possible. If your kindness inspires even one more person to do the same, then it's worth it. So, one Saturday morning, Jamal found himself sitting in front of a camera in Mrs. Price's deli. The interviewer, a woman with a kind smile, asked him why he'd decided to help Robert. Jamal fidgeted slightly, glancing at his mom for reassurance before answering. I just wanted to make someone's day a little better, he said simply. I didn't think it would turn into all this. And how does it feel to know your actions have inspired so many people? The interviewer asked. Jamal thought for a moment. It feels Good, he admitted. But I think it's not just about me. It's about how we can all do something, even if it's small. Kindness doesn't have to cost a lot. It just has to come from the heart. The interview aired later that week, and soon, even more people reached out, offering to help Robert and others in need. Donations poured into local shelters, and businesses began partnering with the Kindness Fund to provide free meals to those struggling. One crisp autumn afternoon, Jamal was sitting at the bus stop with Robert, just like always, when a familiar figure appeared. It was the man in the plaid jacket, but this time he wasn't alone. In his hands, he carried 2 large bags of groceries. "Mind if I join you?" the man asked hesitantly. Robert glanced at Jamal, then back at the man, and nodded. "Sure." The man set the bags down in front of Robert. "I thought you could use these," he said. "It's not much, but it's a start." Robert looked at the bags, then at the man, and smiled faintly. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but sincere. The 3 of them sat together, an unlikely trio brought together by a moment of kindness that had started with a sandwich and a boy who refused to give up on the good in people. Months later, Jamal stood in front of a crowded room at his school auditorium. He'd been invited to speak at a community event about his experience with Robert and the lessons he'd learned. His palms were sweaty, and his heart raced, but as he looked out at the faces of his neighbors, classmates, and even Robert sitting in the front row, he felt a steady calm wash over him. "I've learned a lot this past year," Jamal began, "about kindness, about standing up for what's right, and about how small actions can create big changes. When I first brought Mr. Robert lunch, I didn't think it would matter much, but it did. Not just for him, but for me, and for all of us." He paused, scanning the crowd. "Sometimes the world can feel really heavy, like there's too much hate and not enough love. But what I've learned is that love doesn't have to be loud to make a difference. It can be quiet. It can be one person choosing to see someone instead of walking past them. And it can grow." The audience erupted into applause, but Jamal's gaze stayed on Robert, who was clapping with a wide, genuine smile. That night, as Jamal lay in bed, staring at the stars through his window, he felt a deep sense of peace. He thought about how a single act of kindness had sparked something so much bigger than he could have imagined. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Because kindness, Jamal realized, was more than an action. It was a force, one that could ripple through a community, soften hardened hearts, and remind everyone of the power of humanity.